Welcome to Lecture 4.2, Complexity Without the State. With this lecture, we are moving on from studying the earliest agricultural societies to study the development of social complexity. We have 6 main learning objectives this lecture. First, we will discuss Freed and Service's categories for the forms of social organization. Second, we will learn about Child's 10 criteria that define urban societies. Third, we will examine the explanations for the emergence of social complexity. Fourth, we will outline the development of Stonehenge and the social and economic context surrounding the construction of this monument. Fifth, we will cover the evidence for the function and political organization of Pueblo Bonito and Cahokia. Sixth, we will review the current theories of the organization of the Society of Great Zimbabwe. As we see in current events within Hawaii and around the world, sovereignty and competing claims to authority are important topics that can impassion people to sacrifice their own lives and to threaten to take the lives of others. Sovereign authorities claim jurisdiction over all of the inhabitable world, but their exercise of authority varies. Nevertheless, universally centralized authority and wealth inequality are common features of sovereign entities. While Lewis Henry Morgan and V. Gordon Childe, who, as you will remember, were seminal figures in the development of anthropology and archaeology, thought that the so-called origin of civilization was inevitable after the development of agriculture. It was seen as a natural progression. However, Childe, due to his Marxist outlook, also thought that it was not too late to seek an alternative social organization, and that the study of archaeology could help guide us. More recently, archaeologists have reframed the archaeological narrative to describe the development of sovereignty not as an inevitable advancement, but as a push towards inequality. The question remains, why would people accept increasing wealth inequality and increasing authority over their lives? Essentially, there are only 2 possible explanations for why people would accept the authority of a sovereign, either through consensus building or coercion, typically either by threat of force or use of violence. This is why we obey the laws of the sovereign authorities that govern our conduct, right? You might obey some laws because you agree that they should be laws. You might agree that you should not steal from others, so you wouldn't do it even if you were sure that you wouldn't get caught. Other laws you might only obey because you are concerned that you might get caught. For example, you might not believe that cannabis should be illegal, but you wouldn't buy it or smoke it because you are concerned about getting caught. While you might not experience violence if the police caught you using cannabis, the threat is there. If you don't pay the fine and do your court-mandated community service, then you'll be arrested. Men with guns will come and physically take you and lock you up in a cage. This is violence, yeah? So these are important topics, and archaeology can help us to understand how we arrived at this situation. Before we can begin to discuss this topic, we need to have a vocabulary to describe the types of societies that we are concerned about. The most commonly used vocabularies were developed by the anthropologists Morton Freed and Elman Service. Freed described 4 basic types of societies: egalitarian, ranked, stratified, and state level. In egalitarian societies, social status differences are based solely on individual skills and abilities as well as age and gender. In ranked societies, according to Freed, there are relatively few prestige positions, and status is ascribed by attributes such as birth order. Despite the presence of a social hierarchy, the elites have relatively little power over others. In stratified societies, there is unequal access to resources, and this access is linked to social status, determined by the prestige they enjoy. To maintain and demonstrate their inequality of access, elites were motivated to increase production of commodities. This also places an increased demand on labor on households and kin groups, as well as whole communities. States are super-kin entities with defined jurisdictional boundaries and enforcement capabilities in the form of police and military. Elman Service also defined 4 types of societies based on their scale of social organization: bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. Although defined differently, Service's categories roughly correspond to Freed's categories. Both Freed and Service viewed the development of political complexity as a process whereby the basic unit of social organization and economic production transitioned from the household and kin group to the super-kin scale. This essentially echoed an earlier concept put forward by Lewis Henry Morgan. V. Gordon Childe was less interested in the search for the origins of the state and more interested in the development of what he called urban societies. Childe proposed 10 criteria to identify urban societies: urban centers, surplus production and storage, taxes, monumental architecture, a ruling class, a writing system, exact and predictive sciences, sophisticated art, foreign trade, and specialist craftsmen. Although these criteria are archaeologically detectable, it is unclear whether they were actually the most relevant aspects of these societies for understanding the development of social complexity. The inverse of urban development, as the archaeologist Norman Yaffe has pointed out, is rural development. In other words, before there were cities, there was no country because everything was country. Nowadays, archaeologists are more likely to embrace a comparative approach to state formation, which is also the way we will approach this topic. Weighing all the evidence, we see that all societies have inequality, but the differences in wealth and status become greater in some societies and lesser in others. Moreover, societies followed multiple pathways to the development of social complexity, as well as multiple pathways to diversity, as well as multiple pathways to social collapse. One of the most basic differences in the ways that states emerged is as primary states, or without the influence of other states, and as secondary states, which developed under the influence of other states. Through expansion, some states developed into entities known as empires. An empire is a political entity that encompasses diverse societies under a single sovereign authority. Typically, they cover a very large area and are thus logistically challenging to study archaeologically. The source of power in empires comes from the control of information, the administration of bureaucracy, control of resources and labor, and deployment of symbols of power. Okay, enough theory, let's start to drill down into some examples. Our first stop is the Polynesian island of Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. It is one of the most remote places in the world, surrounded by the Pacific for thousands of miles. On Rapa Nui, there were no cities, and the population was probably always relatively low. There is no evidence for the development of wealth, and there was no regular contact with the outside world until European explorers reached the island. Rapa Nui is most famous for the giant stone statues of heads called moai. For centuries, outsiders have asked why the ancient people of Rapa Nui would erect moai across the island. The current theory is that their construction was sponsored by leaders who were locked in competition for prestige, which they gained from this enigmatic but clearly dramatic act. The archaeological record reveals this competition spurred cycles of construction, including rock quarry, transportation, and erection. Some scholars suggest that this aggressive, competitive statue building cycle had a detrimental effect on the tiny island's ecology, leading to deforestation. As resources became scarce, statue building ended, and violence might have also increased. However, other archaeologists challenge these interpretations. Rapa Nui is a particularly interesting example of how societies can develop political complexity without state bureaucracy. Nevertheless, ancient Rapa Nui society achieved the construction of elaborate monuments. There was no obvious Rapa Nui political elite class. According to Freed's scheme, Rapa Nui would be classed as a ranked or stratified society, while under Service's scheme it would be described as a chiefdom. Clearly there was no centralized state authority. Rapa Nui, though unique in its particular expression of political complexity, speaks to a general principle of complex societies. They marshal large numbers of people to labor on projects to build big things. Why do they all do this? The next site we will look at is one of the most famous archaeological sites in the entire world, Stonehenge. When we look at Stonehenge, which is located on the Salisbury Plain in England, we see a standing stone ring. However, this is not how the site has always looked. Research has demonstrated that the site formed in multiple phases between the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, between about 5,000 to 3,500 years ago, and was used for another 500 years after that. For centuries, people who have seen Stonehenge have puzzled about who built the site and why. Speculation included Romans, Druids, Danes, and Greeks. More recent New Age-inspired people have invoked mystical forces or described it as an earth mystery. Recent studies of Stonehenge have emphasized the importance of context of the regional landscape where Stonehenge was situated to understand site function. The first phase of Stonehenge construction began during the late Neolithic about 5,000 years ago. At that time, the site consisted of a round earthen ditch, about 110 meters in diameter. Within the earthen ditch was erected a ring of wooden posts. During the second stage, which spanned 5,000 years until 4,500 years ago, during the late Neolithic, the posts were removed, and the post holes and ditch were filled in, and a new wooden post structure was erected in the center of the site. Cremated human remains were deposited in the ditch and post holes before they were filled in. The third phase, which occurred during the early Bronze Age, between 4,500 and 3,500 years ago, actually encompasses a series of 6 subphases. During stage 3A, bluestones, approximately 2 to 2.5 meters in height and weighing up to 2 tons, were imported from a source in Wales, more than 240 kilometers distant, and were placed in a series of holes excavated in a circular or semicircular formation. During Phase 3B, massive blocks of a hard sandstone known as sarsen were quarried about 30 kilometers distant and brought to Stonehenge. These sarsen monoliths were erected upright in a circular formation and capped by blocks to form lintels held together by fitted joints. Inside the sarsen circle, additional sarsen stones, known as trilithons, were erected in a horseshoe shape that was oriented to the northeast. During phases 3C to 3F, the bluestones were rearranged and holes were dug in concentric circles around the sarsen circle. Lithic monuments are found at many late Neolithic and early Bronze Age sites across Western Europe. But even in this context, Stonehenge is exceptional. Also on the Salisbury Plain, we find several ceremonial mound and enclosure sites. For example, the avenue is a path with embankments and ditches over 1/2 mile in length between the river Avon and Stonehenge. The Cursus site, which you see here, is an earthen platform nearly 2 miles long running east to west and might actually predate the Stonehenge site. Some of the most interesting archaeology comes from the late Neolithic Durrington Walls site, which is probably a feasting site located about 2.8 kilometers from Stonehenge. At Durrington Walls, archaeologists found evidence of a series of houses and 3 wood circle monuments that appears to have been a late Neolithic village contemporaneous with Phase 3B at Stonehenge. But this was no ordinary village. There is limited evidence of plant food consumption, but meat was apparently consumed in large quantities, especially pork and beef. Because there were few bones of very young animals, they were probably not raised on site, like one would expect for a normal village. They were probably brought in from elsewhere, probably for ritual feasts. Archaeologists believe that feasting sites, like Durrington Walls, might hold the key to understanding how the construction of monumental sites like Stonehenge were organized. Logistically, we can assume that construction of monuments like Stonehenge would have required large amounts of organized labor. The laborers would have needed to have been fed while they worked, and they would have required housing on site. They would have also required a means of transportation for the quarried stones. Because large cooperative labor was clearly highly organized, but in the absence of state bureaucracy, people were probably motivated to participate not through a threat of force, but through the exercise of soft power by charismatic individuals who inherited a certain level of status from the status of their family. In this context, soft power would have involved the redistribution of surpluses to sponsor these large projects. The British archaeologist Colin Renfrew has suggested that The construction of Stonehenge was sponsored by chiefs who presided over a local chiefdom and whose territory and therefore resources increased over time. Renfrew's hypothesis posits that chiefs enjoyed an elevated status and use their elevated status to control the redistribution of resources in the context of work feasts, which were a means of financing monument construction. Evidence for status differences during this period was provided by two burials with elaborate grave goods found in 2002. The most famous of the two burials became known as the Amesbury Archer, which you can see here. It was an early Bronze Age burial, roughly contemporaneous with Phase 3 of the construction of Stonehenge. This individual was male and was buried with numerous grave goods, including slate wrist guards, a bone pin, copper knives, pots, boar tusks, a flint cache, arrowheads, and golden earrings. The grave goods suggest that the Amesbury Archer enjoyed a high status in his society at the time of his death, the type of status we would expect of a chieftain capable of organizing monumental construction projects. Interestingly, isotopic analyses suggest that the Amesbury Archer was raised in the Alps, far away from where he was buried. This raises a question about how an individual from the outside could attain such an elevated status in a foreign land. The second burial was also interred with elaborate grave goods, and thus also supports Renfrew's hypothesis of status differentiation. Stonehenge appears to have primarily served a ritual function. Unlike other nearby monumental sites, like Durrington Walls, there is no evidence of domestic habitation nearby. However, it does have an interesting connection to domestic architecture. The Salisbury Plain, where both Durrington Walls and Stonehenge are located, was originally a forest, but with the introduction of agriculture it became a grassland. This, along with the documented presence of wooden post structures, suggests that the people who cleared the land and built the sites were also experienced in cutting and working wood. Further support for the societal experience with wood is found in the stone construction of the Sarsen Circle. The engineers who originally designed these monuments used mortise and tenon and tongue and groove joints to hold the lintels on top of the upright monoliths, which are common woodworking techniques and which were presumably used in domestic structure construction at that time. This observation has prompted some archaeologists to suggest that Stonehenge was a symbolic, monumental version of the household writ large, or a monument to a changing landscape. Because Stonehenge was built along significant astronomical alignments, it was also potentially used to make celestial observations. Many people think that it must have served a ritual function of some kind. In this regard, it is similar to several other types of monuments in Western Europe. With all this context in mind, what do us archaeologists think Stonehenge meant for the people who built it? I say us archaeologists because now that you have completed most of this class, you too have probably started to think like an archaeologist. But as we know, not all archaeologists think alike. This is why we have great debates in archaeology. Well, a famous site like Stonehenge is certain to draw a debate. Here we have perspectives of three archaeologists. Barbara Bender noted that any interpretation of a singular meaning of the site that was used and modified for over 1,500 years will essentially freeze the past without linking it to ongoing historical processes. For Bender, Stonehenge represents one element of an evolving socio-natural landscape and the blurring of the lines between natural and cultural worlds. The construction and modification of the monument itself would have directed people's very movements across the landscape, who would thereby come to embody the authority of the chiefs who sponsored the construction activities. Similarly, Julian Thomas pointed out that Stonehenge never had meaning, by which he means that over 80 generations, the meaning and context of Stonehenge changed. After the first few generations, it was a long-standing, though potentially dynamic part of the landscape. Ian Hodder has argued that with the expansion of the basic social unit past the household to the inter-household scale, large monuments like Stonehenge were built as the materialization of the household at a larger inter-household scale that tied people and households to the landscape at specific locations. Mike Parker Pearson has proposed that while Durrington Walls was occupied and apparently built for the living, Stonehenge was a ritual and burial site apparently created for the dead. While the wooden structure at Durgington Walls was essentially temporary, like life itself, Stonehenge was permanent, like death itself. Stop on our magical mystery tour of world prehistory brings us to Pueblo Bonito, in the great site of Chaco Canyon in Arizona. By AD 700, increasing social complexity in southwestern societies led Hohokam societies to build large mounds and ball courts in what is today southwestern Arizona. This is some of the largest and most impressive ancient architecture in North America. For example, at the largest Hohokam site of Snaketown, dated to about AD 1000, a community with an estimated population of 300 to 600 people constructed two large ball courts and irrigation systems, which would have required massive communal labor to construct and to maintain. Snaketown was created by an archaeological culture group known as Hohokam, which was just one of the large cultural groups that flourished in the region of the American Southwest, known as the Four Corners region, because it is centered at the intersections of southwestern Colorado, southeastern Utah, northeastern Arizona, and northwestern New Mexico. The site of Chaco Canyon, located in northwestern New Mexico, is one of the most impressive sites in a region of generally impressive sites. Starting after AD 800, ancestral Puebloan people began to occupy the Chaco Canyon, and over time it would grow to become the center of a regional settlement network. Chaco is famous for its many multi-storied structures known as great houses. However, no less impressive are the several dams, canals, and cisterns that were built and maintained through collective labor projects to manage the water supply at Chaco Canyon. The largest great house in Chaco Canyon is known as Pueblo Bonito. It is an enormous semicircular structure constructed over an approximately 200-year period beginning around AD 800. Due to the excellent preservation of the desert, the wooden beams used in the site construction are still present. Because of this, archaeologists can use dendrochronology or tree ring dating to derive precise construction age determinations. Similarly, we know that the site was abandoned by about AD 1250. At its peak, Pueblo Bonito had 650 rooms, a large central plaza, and over 20 semi-subterranean ceremonial structures known as kivas. With this much infrastructure, the site could have housed up to 1,200 people. Surprisingly, archaeologists have found relatively few fireplaces, far too few to have supported domestic activities for a large permanent population. This combination of features have prompted some archaeologists to interpret the Pueblo Bonito site as a ceremonial center that temporarily housed a small population of perhaps 100 people, rather than a long-term, large habitation site. It is also possible that the function changed over time. For example, some archaeologists think that the site might have begun as an elite residence around AD 800, but within 200 years it might have served a primarily ceremonial function. Two large mounds of cultural debris located in front of Pueblo Bonito, which were later plastered to serve as a ceremonial platform, provide information about the function of the site and about the identities of the site occupants. Excavation of these mounds produced massive quantities of ceramics used for ceremonial feasting, including ritual drinking of cacao and Ilex vomitoria, a caffeinated drink that was imported into the Chaco Canyon. As we have seen elsewhere, the archaeology of burials can yield great evidence on the existence of social inequality. At Pueblo Bonito, interments from rooms 33 and 38 interpreted as elite burials included lavish grave goods, including turquoise, jet, and macaws, indicating elite access to a range of exotic materials from extensive trade networks. Additional evidence of the presence of an elite class is found in the sheer massive scale of Pueblo Bonito. Archaeologists have estimated that 200,000 trees were involved in the site construction, and that it would have required about 800,000 person-hours of labor. Chaco was impressive not just for its large architecture, but also for the associated infrastructure. Satellite imagery identified 200 miles of roads connecting the great houses within Chaco Canyon and roads running out of Chaco Canyon. Sites in the region linked by the so-called Chacoan Network all share some similar features, including architectural similarities. Although the settlements outside of Chaco do not seem to have been under the direct control of Chaco, elite prestige items like turquoise and jet, as well as more quotidian artifacts, including ceramics and maize, were imported into Chaco Canyon from the sites in the surrounding network. Many archaeologists think that these items came into the Chaco Canyon as either taxes or as feast items, contributed for seasonal gatherings, which punctuated the annual religious cycle. There is little evidence, however, for tax collection, as we conceive of it. For example, there appears to be little evidence for an administrative elite who would collect taxes. If such an impressive site existed for more than 400 years, what caused its collapse? There is considerable evidence that climate change was responsible for the collapse of Chaco. Paleo-environmental evidence suggests that a drought began in AD 1130. At the same time, new construction stopped, and sites began to be abandoned. Interestingly, climate variability might also explain why Chaco Canyon developed in the first place. Some archaeologists have suggested that the many small sites in the Chaco network could reduce the risk of crop failure or other environmental catastrophe by creating reciprocal relationships of mutual support with other communities. However, as the archaeologist Lynn Sebastian has pointed out, much of Chaco Canyon was built during a period of high rainfall, which began around AD 1000. If risk minimization was not an issue, then what explains the rise of Chaco Canyon? One possibility is that it would have permitted the accumulation of agricultural surpluses, which would have potentially been controlled by elites and redistributed to sponsor the construction of great houses as a form of competitive, conspicuous consumption. The next stop on our whirlwind tour of great ancient sites is Cahokia, located just outside of the modern St. Louis on the Mississippi River floodplain. Composed of over 100 earthen mounds, plazas, many burials, and a palisade wall, Cahokia is perhaps the most impressive ancient archaeological site in eastern North America. It is the largest site associated with Mississippian culture, which dates to between AD 1000 and AD 1400, and probably was home to between 4,000 to 40,000 people. The largest mound at Cahokia, known as Monk's Mound, is over 30 meters high, encompasses 60,000 square meters of area, and was built with over 600,000 cubic meters of soil, which is the equivalent of an estimated 21,195,000 half-basket loads. Here you see a picture of me on top of Monk's Mound when I was passing through St. Louis in January 2007. You can see St. Louis in the background over my left shoulder. And it was even colder than it looked. The interpretive museum there is really fantastic though, and I highly recommend you visit if you are ever in the vicinity. Just not in January. I'm sure it's lovely in the fall or the summer. There is evidence for pronounced social inequality at Cahokia, but it is unclear whether we are looking at a chiefdom on the verge of becoming a state, or whether it really was an ancient state. If either option were accurate, then the rulers of Cahokia ruled the surrounding settlements in the American Bottom region as well. Other scholars suggest that the power of the Cahokian rulers was actually limited, but that they were the most powerful of many competing chiefdoms in the region. Some of the best evidence of social inequality at Cahokia was found at a feature identified as Mound 72, which was aligned with Monk's Mound. There, archaeologists found an adult male buried on a bird-shaped platform made with 20,000 shell beads, as well as elaborate grave goods, including points and discs made by skilled artisans. Alongside this individual's remains were the remains of 50 young women and 4 decapitated men. Archaeologists have interpreted this as a mass execution to accompany an elite person into the afterlife. As you could probably predict, we have monumental architecture and evidence for elites, so we must also have evidence for feasting, which was found under Mound 51. There in 1961, archaeologists found a pit filled with pottery, animal bones, and plant remains, interpreted as a feasting refuse pit. The finds include over 500,000 seeds, the bones of over 5,000 deer, and the ceramics of about 18,000 pots. Mound 51 was constructed adjacent to the Grand Plaza with a potential capacity of 30,000 people, which probably served as the feasting ground. Like we asked with Stonehenge, what was the meaning of Cahokia? We have just reviewed the evidence that Cahokia served as a feasting site, and the elites in Cahokia might have conceivably gained and maintained their authority through the organization of these large-scale redistributive events, possibly with a bureaucratic apparatus. Another possibility is that Cahokia was the site of large sporting events. The discovery of several polished stone discs in Mound 72 matches artifacts described in classic ethnographic sources as pieces in a game called Chunky. The game was played by rolling the discs down a line and then striking them with spears. In addition to political feasts and sporting events, the Cahokian people were apparently drawn together and unified through a common ideology, which featured birds. For example, at Mound 51, the bones of swans and prairie chickens were commonly found, and as I previously mentioned, the apparently elite individual was buried on a platform of shell beads in the shape of a bird. In addition, during excavation of Monk's Mound, archaeologists found this artifact, which is known as the Birdman tablet. In addition, certain types of wood, specifically red cedar and cypress, might have actually had symbolic importance and were perhaps burned as incense during feasts or sporting events. Our last stop in this tour of great sites in archaeology will be Great Zimbabwe, located in the modern state of Zimbabwe. The site, which was occupied between AD 1300 and AD 1400, was situated in a fertile valley and across two adjacent hills, which were rich in mineral resources. The site expanded over time from the Northern Hill Complex, which consisted of a large enclosure made of large carved stones, which could have held about 20 huts, as well as a ritual feature. The circular clay and gravel huts which occupied the site were known as Dhaka and were apparently frequently rebuilt. When European explorers first saw this site, they made up elaborate fantasies about who created the site and why, which served to deny the agency of the ancestors of the African people who continued to live in the region. Following the initial site occupation, a second site locus, known as Great Enclosure, was built on the southern hill. The Great Enclosure could have held about 40 huts and contained a solid stone conical-shaped tower. Population estimates for Great Zimbabwe vary from 1,000 to 18,000 people. The people who lived within the walls of Great Zimbabwe were clearly elites who controlled access to trade items. The people who lived within the walls of Great Zimbabwe were clearly elites who controlled access to trade items found at the site, including glazed pottery from China and Iran, glass beads from Syria, and gold which was mined in the region. The enclosures at Great Zimbabwe might have served multiple functions. They could have been defensive, but also served to screen the activities of the elites within the walls from the commoners kept outside of the walls.